In the jungle, the mighty jungle, a lion sleeps tonight. Everyone in the Pride Lands mourns their beloved king Mufasa and the young prince Simba. The king's body was found after a terrible wildebeest stampede. The prince has yet to be found, but is presumed dead. Mufasa is survived by his widow, Queen Sarabi, and his brother Scar, who has succeeded him as king. Already, Scar has instituted several controversial policies, including the merging of the Pride with the local pack of hyenas, but many are far too distraught to oppose him. It seems the only one maintaining any order are the ever-busy Zazu and the only remaining male lion left, Columbo of the Lion Guard. Come on, you know the Lion Guard, the team of animals assembled to protect the Pride Lands. They've always been around. It's not like they were retconned just so some incredibly powerful company could make a preschool show based off one of their most popular films. Anyway, Columbo is an older, scruffier lion and current captain of the Lion Guard. Something about Mufasa's death doesn't sit right with him. With the Queen's permission, Columbo decides to launch an investigation to verify whether Mufasa's death was an accident or if there's something rotten in the state of the Pride Lands. Scar isn't convinced this is necessary, but sees no harm in it. As far as he's concerned, he's pulled off the perfect crime. But will his overconfidence be his undoing? Can Columbo uncover Scar's scheme? Can Columbo still smoke a cigar if he has no opposable sums? Can Columbo crack the case? Hello and welcome to the first episode of Can Columbo Crack the Case? I'm your host, Jackson. And today, we'll be covering the murder of Mufasa from The Lion King. The animated one, naturally. For those of you listening who aren't familiar with the format of Columbo, each episode typically starts by showing the killer committing the crime, then planting or hiding evidence to throw the police off their trail before Columbo gets involved. In this case, our murderer is, well, technically it's the wildebeests, but that's kind of like blaming a bunch of marathon runners for killing someone that fell on them from a third-story window. It's hard to say if the fall killed him or the hooves that trampled him. To make it simple, we'll just name Scar as the murderer, and the victim is his brother, Mufasa. We, the audience, know that Scar killed Mufasa by throwing him off a ledge into a stampede of wildebeests. Then, Scar gaslit Simba into thinking he was responsible for Mufasa's death, and convinced him to run away and never come back. Once he was off, Scar sent his hyena lackeys, Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed, after him. So far, everyone thinks Mufasa and Simba died in a tragic accident, but Columbo won't rest easy until he's tied up all the loose ends and ensured there's no possibility of foul play. Starting with the crime scene. There's not much to go off of. The body was found at the bottom of a gorge and reported by Scar. Upon arrival, there wouldn't be many clues for Columbo to examine, other than dirt and hoof prints. All that's left is Mufasa's lifeless yet surprisingly well-preserved corpse. You'd think after getting trampled by, 50, 60 wildebeest, minimum. After all that, the king should be a mangled, bloody mess. Guess there's no point in looking a gift gazelle in the mouth. Columbo will have to leave the body to the coroners to examine, which in this case would probably be a flock of talking buzzards, with one of them voiced by an A or B tier celebrity from the 90s, maybe Meg Ryan or Tim Robbins? While that's going down, it's time to address the key players in this case. First, there's the new king, Scar. He's profited the most from Mufasa's death. He looks a little sketchy, but Columbo isn't one to profile based on appearance, so he'll withhold judgment for now. Next, there's Sarabi, reigning queen and Mufasa's widow. Perhaps she can shed some light on what happened to her late husband. Maybe there was trouble in paradise? Maybe Sarabi got jealous, or knows a lioness that was jealous of her. Then there's Zazu, the hornbill, who served as Mufasa's major domo. For those of you scratching your head, that means chief steward of a household. There, I saved you one Google search and expanded your vocabulary. Anyway, Zazu has loyally served Mufasa and the royal family for many years, And when Scar reported Simba was in danger, Zazu went along with Scar and Mufasa to help. Word is that he got knocked out during the incident, but Zazu hasn't gone into details about what happened. Lastly, there's Simba's closest friend, Nala. Normally, Columbo doesn't want to get kids wrapped up in his investigations, but if she knows anything that can clear things up, Columbo would be a fool to pass it up. Since Scar is now Columbo's superior, it only makes sense to question him first. Now, Scar is obviously devastated by the tragic loss of his brother and nephew and still grieving their untimely demise. Columbo would know this because that's what Scar tells him verbatim while lounging around and nonchalantly chewing some meat off of a bone. After Columbo gives his report, he'd want to get Scar's side of what went down. Scar would naturally roll his eyes and recount how he discovered Simba was in danger and went to get help. The lionesses were out hunting, and only Zazu and Mufasa were around. He showed them where Simba was, and Mufasa recklessly leapt down before Scar could form a plan. Scar claims he used caution and took a safer route climbing down, but in the end, his brother slipped and fell into the stampede, while Simba met an equally grim fate. Columbo would offer his sympathies and ask what Zazu was doing during all this. Scar would brush it off and claim that Zazu might have passed out from shock, or a sudden gust of wind could have blown him into a large rock. He was too busy trying to help save Simba to notice. Scar is tuned out by this point and is bored by this questioning. Columbo would praise Scar for his heroism and how fortunate he was to come across Simba when he did. He'd then ask Scar if he goes to the gorge often, but Scar wouldn't see why that matters. To which Columbo would explain that the gorge isn't exactly a hot spot in the Pride Lands, and was wondering what Scar was doing there in the first place. Perhaps a little hunting of his own? At which point Scar would be irritated by this and explain how he was keeping an eye on his nephew. After the incident in the elephant graveyard, Scar wanted to make sure his nephew wasn't getting into any more trouble, and he did so from a distance. If he had known a herd of wildebeest were nearby, he would have stopped Simba from going in the gorge in the first place. Columbo would recall how he heard about Simba wandering into the elephant graveyard, but he didn't know the full story yet. All this talk about cubs getting into trouble reminds Columbo of when he was a cub. Back in his old pride, he was a bit of a show-off, always trying to oppress others by doing dangerous stuff, sneaking into dangerous territory or places that were off-limits. He'd always get such a tongue-lashing from his mom. It just goes to show that no matter where you're from, kids are always going to be adventurous little scamps. Scar wouldn't be interested in the slightest with what Columbo has to say, and would be quick to dismiss him so he could get back to his lunch. Columbo would nod and take his leave, but then he'd stop and say one more thing. Looking back, Columbo only did that stuff because someone told him not to do so in the first place. He can't help but wonder who could have told Simba about those places and planted those ideas in the first place. Columbo would shrug, excuse himself, and leave for real this time. As for Scar, that last question would surely ruin his appetite. Let's pause the investigation for just a moment and see what Columbo has learned. During these little in-between segments, we'll review Columbo's progress in the investigation, kind of like going over evidence in a Phoenix Wright game. First off, we have Mufasa's corpse. Off the record, I understand why Mufasa's body isn't bloodied and mangled, because this takes place in a Disney film. Realistically, he should have limbs twisting in the wrong way, bones jutting out, maybe a caved-in skull, but we're playing by Disney's rules, so if Mufasa's body is still intact, so be it. Second, we have Scar's testimony regarding what he was doing during the stampede, including the fact that he's been keeping tabs on his own nephew for a while. Third, the elephant graveyard incident. While there isn't a direct correlation between that incident and the stampede yet, that could change as Columbo continues to investigate. Alright, let's unpause and get back to Columbo. After meeting with Scar, Columbo would naturally go looking for the Queen next. But while he's descending Pride Rock, he might notice something. A lioness cub curled in the corner, sniffling. It doesn't take a detective to tell she's been crying for quite some time, like she lost someone precious in her life. Columbo should really focus on the investigation, but... Oh, dang it. The investigation is temporarily on hold. There's a sad lion cub that needs consoling. Okay, I'm good. Rather than straight up approaching her, Columbo's going to keep a respectful distance, and ask her if she minds if he lies down across from her. He's working on a tough case, but he's no longer in his prime. The old lion needs to rest more these days, even more than lions usually do. She doesn't say anything, but also doesn't object. So he'd get comfy the way cats do, where they're resting their heads on their front paws, and ask why she looks so down in the dumps. He'd guess she's mourning the king, or previous king, and prince like everyone else. She doesn't reply, but it seems obvious that she is. Columbo can relate, since he knew Mufasa pretty well. Nice guy. Was willing to let Columbo join the pride after his last one kicked him out for being too old. It was too bad that Columbo never got to meet Mufasa's kid, Simba. He heard good things about him. At the mention of Simba, Nala's mood takes a turn for the worse, and gives Columbo the answer he was looking for. He reasons that it makes sense she knew Simba, what with them being the only lion cubs around. Since she was so close with him, he'd ask her what Simba was like, but Nala isn't feeling very talkative. He'd understand and offer a compromise, a guessing game. He'd guess what Simba was like, and she'd let him know how close he was. He'd start by asking if Simba was a real scaredy cat, the kind that gets scared of their own shadow. No response. He'd figured that makes sense. Who ever heard of a cowardly lion? Then he'd ask if he was snooty like that hornbill Columbo always sees. A real snob. Too good to mingle with the commoners. A lazy bum like him that enjoys a good nap more than a hunt. Again, no answer, but she does let a giggle slip. If he's not a coward, nor the uptight kind of kid, Columbo would guess that Simba must have been a real tough type, always ready to tussle. He'd ask if Simba ever got a chance to tussle with her and pin her down, to which Nala would scoff and say, he wishes. Columbo figured that would be the case. She's Serafina's kid, if he's not mistaken. He's sure she'll grow up to be a fine huntress someday. It also sounds like Simba was quite the scamp, a real troublemaker. He'd ask if that's fair to say, and she'd say he isn't, or wasn't, always that way. What's that supposed to mean, he'd ask. Nala would tell him that he always was a feisty cub, but it wasn't until he suggested they go to the elephant graveyard that he started getting into trouble. Columbo would act surprised as if he hadn't heard about the incident, and wondered if she could be so kind as to tell him her side of the story. It's tough keeping up with latest gossip when you're out patrolling the savannah every day. Nala would be reluctant, but shares what happened at the elephant graveyard. How she and Simba gave Zazu the slip with a catchy musical number, their run-in with the hyenas, and Mufasa coming to their rescue. Columbo would note how her tone shifts from humorous to fearful to amazed as she told the story, as if it were a memory from a bygone era, and not a few days ago. Once Columbo has a better idea of what happened, he'd clarify that it was Simba's idea to go there in the first place. Nala would confirm, but question what difference it makes. Simba was acting strange, and she didn't notice it in time. Maybe if she had noticed sooner, she could have done something. Maybe she could have stopped him. Maybe he'd still be here. Nala would have released the waterworks again if Columbo didn't step in to console her. He'd reassure her that there are some things that can't be prepared for. Sometimes bad things will happen. Sometimes good things will happen. That's just how the circle of life works. You can't change that. But if she's as tough as she says she is, Columbo would be sure that she did everything she could to protect him. And if Simba's up there watching with all the other great kings, he wouldn't want her to be blaming herself. That brings a smile to her face, and Columbo would get up once he's sure she'll be okay. But before he goes, there's just one more thing. He'd ask her if there was anyone else Simba spent time with other than Nala. Aside from her, she says that Simba spent most of his time with his family or Zazu. He never wandered off on his own. No one would let him. This makes sense to Columbo since Simba was the prince. It would be pretty reckless to leave him unattended. If that's the case, he must have learned about the elephant graveyard from someone close to the royal family. But that's probably not important. He'd wish her a nice day and leave for real this time. It's at this point we pause again and review the new info Columbo picked up from that conversation. He knows what happened to Simba and Nala at the elephant graveyard, and that it was Simba's idea to go there. Someone close to the royal family told him about it, but there aren't any clues as to who that might be, and if this is connected to the stampede. It's also worth noting that the cubs were almost killed by hyenas, but Mufasa warded them off easily. And now all of a sudden, Scar is just letting these hyenas into the pride. Lastly, it's safe to remove Nala from the list of suspects. She's not capable of inciting a stampede, and she clearly viewed Simba as a dear friend. Maybe more? It's none of Columbo's business, and has nothing to do with the case. What does have something to do with the case is the coroner's report. Say what you will about buzzards, they are thorough when it comes to inspecting bodies. Their analysis isn't going to be top-notch, but they'd notice anything out of the ordinary. It's been a hot minute since Columbo's reported to the king, so he might as well share these findings with Scar. Upon arrival, Columbo would notice Scar wrapping up a discussion with a trio of shifty-looking hyenas. Well, shiftier than the usual hyena. Once they're gone, he'd tell Columbo to get his report over with so he can go back to business ruling his kingdom. Columbo would comply and let Scar know that he hasn't made too much progress. They've had no luck narrowing down which wildebeest herd killed Mufasa and Simba, or who triggered the stampede. Scar barely registers this and continues to pick the crud out from under his claws. As for the coroner's report, the buzzards didn't find anything too unusual. Mufasa's body was roughed up, but not as badly as it should be. At this point, I'm sure those of you listening are getting tired of me ranting about the body, but there is a reason for this. Columbo would present the possibility that Mufasa wasn't down there the whole time. It's possible that he started climbing out of the gorge, but someone might have thrown him off. This grabs Scar's attention. He'd want to know what evidence Columbo has to back up this absurd claim. To that, Columbo would point out that the buzzards noticed some irregular puncture marks on Mufasa's paws, ones made by claws. Columbo thought it might have been the hyenas Mufasa faced at the elephant graveyard, but hyenas are known for biting, not clawing. Plus, according to Nala, the hyenas didn't put up much of a fight. Scar would suggest that Mufasa got those marks during the fall, but Columbo would disagree. The puncture marks were too clean. If Mufasa had hit some jagged rocks during his fall, there would be more prominent lacerations. Columbo intends to look into this, but would advise Scar to use caution. Scar wouldn't like the sound of that, and demand to know what Columbo is rambling about. The older lion would theorize that the perpetrator clawed Mufasa while he was climbing out, and did so right in front of him. Now, if Columbo was clawing his way out of a gorge and an unfamiliar predator approached him, he wouldn't trust them to have his best intentions in mind. After all, that's just how the way things work in the circle of life. However, if it was someone Columbo trusted, he would let his guard down. He thinks that someone Mufasa trusted killed him, and that can mean only one thing. Scar would rise to his feet and warn Columbo to think carefully about what he says next, though it sounds more like a threat. Columbo would disregard that and tell him that he thinks that same killer will go for Scar next. Scar would be taken aback by this, but look more puzzled than frightened. Columbo would suggest that the killer Mufasa trusted might already be in Scar's inner circle. The Lion Guard haven't noticed any new predators enter the Pride Lands as of late, so it would have to be someone who already lives here. The king would settle down and tell him he'll make sure to double his hyena guard. Columbo would approve and excuse himself to continue the investigation, but not before expressing his admiration for the king. To think that after his nephew was almost killed by hyenas, Scar brokered an alliance with them and allowed them into the Pride. What a guy! If it were up to Columbo, he'd never let a hyena set foot on Pride Rock ever again. But apparently, Scar is willing to put his personal feelings aside and do what's good for the kingdom. After that, Columbo would depart. And it's here we pause yet again to examine what we've learned and assess how much danger our hero is in. If you haven't noticed, Columbo has a tendency to check in on the murderer and agitate them by informing them on his progress. A risky strategy, since this could provoke the killer into letting something slip, but also risk upsetting them, to the point where they could try to take Columbo off the case or take him out of the picture. Since Columbo aired in the 60s, there was never any risk of him facing retaliation, but it ain't the 60s anymore. In these hypothetical situations, Columbo could be taken off the case or killed. At the moment, Scar doesn't have a good reason to end the investigation just yet, and having Columbo killed is too risky. Relations between hyenas and the lions are unstable enough as is. If word spreads that a hyena killed the captain of the lion guard, war could break out and there'd be no one left to hunt and provide food for Scar. For now, he'll let Columbo live, but he's getting sick of him getting close to the truce. Columbo needs to wrap up his investigation soon, before Scar arranges an accident for him. Speaking of, the coroner's report has revealed the possibility that Mufasa almost climbed out of the gorge, but was thrown off by someone he trusted. Someone with claws. There's also something suspicious about Scar's relationship with the hyenas, but that isn't a pressing matter at this time. Something's bugging Columbo like a stubborn tick, and there's only one animal with the answers he needs. Zazu. Columbo would have to do some tracking, but he'd find the hornbill out and about, performing his royal duties and looking quite exhausted. Jumpy too, as he's easily startled by Columbo's arrival. Zazu wouldn't have time to spare, but he'd answer a few of Columbo's questions. First thing Columbo would do is ask why Zazu looks all frazzled. Zazu wouldn't take kindly to that, but would explain that he's frazzled because he's in over his head cleaning up the messes the hyenas have been making. Since Scar merged their pack with the Pride, the hyenas have overstepped their boundaries and have been hunting willy-nilly with no respect to the natural order. Columbo wouldn't understand what the big deal is. It's not any different than when the lionesses go hunting. Zazu would point out that there is a significant difference, an understanding. If the herds grow too large, they will eat all the grass. Once the grass is gone, the herds will either starve or migrate elsewhere, leaving nothing for the lions to hunt. The lions keep the herds in check by killing the weak, elderly, and lazy, allowing the best of the herds to propagate and foster superior offspring capable of leading the next generation. The lions take only what they need, and when they die, their bodies become the grass and feed the herds. Columbo would be familiar with the circle of life and knows how the system works, just like any other animal. What he wants to know is where the hyenas factor into this. Zazu would tell him to be patient and that he's getting to that. The hyenas were meant to be scavengers. They were allowed to take what scraps weren't already taken. Lions can't be available for every single death in the Pride Lands, after all. Lately, Scar has made promises to make sure every hyena is fed, and has given them free rein to hunt as much as they want, meaning that they hunt without restraint, and are decimating the herd's numbers. Hence, why Zazu has been preoccupied with dealing with the complaints from the herd leaders. If this keeps up, it could be the end of the Pride Lands as they know it. To Columbo, that sounds like a bit of an exaggeration. It's not like the savannah is going to turn into some sort of lifeless wasteland now that Scar is in charge and the hyenas are running wild. Zazu isn't too sure about that. There have been rumors of herds plotting to migrate elsewhere if this keeps up. Some animals have even mentioned building a dam upriver in retaliation. Again, Columbo wouldn't buy into that, but he would wonder if Zazu is showing some bias after his incident at the elephant graveyard. At the mention of that, his mood somehow sours even further. He clarifies that he did everything he could to stop those cubs from going out, and that any rumors Columbo may have heard about Zazu and Orion were untrue. Columbo wouldn't push him on that topic, but he would ask how those cubs could have gotten away from him in the first place. Zazu is still trying to figure that out. One minute, they were all having a wonderful time at the watering hole, and then the next minute, a musical number broke out of nowhere. Simba and Nala escaped in the madness, and it took him about 20 minutes or so to catch up. Columbo would be impressed with how much ground the cubs were able to cover. Sometimes he forgets how fast cubs can be at that age. What really ruffles Zazu's feathers is that the hyenas from the incident are also Scar's top lieutenants. For what reason, Zazu can't fathom. Zazu would question what any of this has to do with the investigation, and Columbo would apologize for getting off track. He wants to get Zazu's account of what happened at the gorge. Zazu wouldn't be thrilled about this, but would be willing to share what he remembers. It started out as a normal day when all of a sudden, Scar came bounding over to warn Mufasa that Simba was in danger. Zazu went with them and they found Simba clinging to a branch over the stampede. Mufasa jumped into action and descended into the gorge, while Zazu was in a panic. And then, everything went dark. When Zazu came to, the stampede was over and he found Mufasa dead. Zazu went to report this to the Queen, but Scar had already delivered the news. Columbo would want to know if Zazu has these blackouts very often. Zazu would say that he doesn't. A strong gust of wind must have blown him into a rock or something. Now, Columbo would find that very interesting. He wouldn't have known that it was a common occurrence for birds to be knocked out by sudden gusts of winds like that. If that happened to him, he would have guessed someone might have attacked him. Zazu rules out that possibility since he had a clear aerial view of the surrounding area when he flew to the gorge. There wasn't any other creature to be spotted within the vicinity. No one except you and Scar, Columbo points out. That insinuation wouldn't sit well with Zazu, and he would warn Columbo to choose his words carefully when speaking about their king. Like it or not, Scar rules these lands, and if either of them speak out of line, he could do away with them on a whim. If he said Zazu was knocked out by a gust of wind, then Zazu has no choice but to take his word. Seeing the bird's eyes dart around as he checks his surroundings for eavesdroppers, Columbo would apologize for upsetting him and end their discussion there. He meant no disrespect. Though he can't help but wonder, when did Scar start making those promises to help the hyenas? He apologizes again for taking up the hornbill's time and leaves him to his royal duties. The good news is that Columbo was able to glean some good intel out of Zazu. For starters, he has a better understanding of why the hyenas follow Scar. Sounds like he made a lot of promises to them. While we're at it, we also learned that Scar was the one who told Zazu that a gust of wind took him out of commission. It seems like Scar has total control over the narrative, and no one is pressing him on it. But Columbo isn't so compliant. He wants to know the truth. Like what happened to Simba. So far, everyone's taken Scar at his word that the young prince died in the stampede. But why would Mufasa risk his life to go after his son if he didn't think there was a chance he could save him? Why would Simba's body go missing, but not Mufasa's? And if Simba's not dead, where is he? Columbo might have an answer for that last question. Zazu mentioned that Simba was able to cover a great distance in the short time he slipped away. If a cub like that could survive a wildebeest stampede, how far could he go? At the end of the gorge is a nasty patch of brambles and thorns, but if a cub is small enough, they could navigate it. Columbo would pursue this theory and safely go around the thorns to find a scorching desert on the other side. It's a long shot, but if there's a chance Simba is out there, Columbo is going to take it. For the next few days, he'd scour the desert looking for any signs of life, anything that might suggest Simba survived. Days would pass, and the lion guard would start to worry. Scar tells him not to make a fuss about it and worry about keeping his subjects in line. A week passes until finally, Columbo makes his triumphant return and is ready to close the case. It's time to meet Scar one last time. The sun is setting on the horizon, and Scar is finishing up his dinner. Surrounded by his hyena lackeys, his morose queen, a handful of lionesses, and Zazu singing show tunes for his amusement. He's just about to retire to his cave for the evening, but all of a sudden, an announcement rings out. Columbo is back, and he's not alone. Scar grumbles as soon as Columbo climbs up to his perch. He apologizes for his absence, but tells Scar that he has wonderful news. Scar tells him that this can wait until the morning, but Columbo insists that this cannot wait. Gasps ring out from below as Columbo is then joined by a meerkat and a warthog, with the former cracking jokes about being in the lion's den. Just as Scar is about to demand the meaning of all this, his bravado is blown out by the arrival of his nephew, Simba. Columbo is the only one there not dumbfounded. Sarabi cracks a smile for the first time in weeks and rushes to the cub's side. Nala is overjoyed to see her friend alive and well again, while Scar just watches stupefied as the mother embraces her missing cub. Columbo explains that the reason he was missing was that he had a theory. He went out into the desert to see if there was any way that a lion cub could possibly survive out on his own. Wouldn't you know it? There was an oasis about a day or two away. It was there that Columbo found Simba being cared for by Timon and Pumbaa, who he quickly introduces, and told them about how everyone was worried about the young prince. Scar tells him how delighted he is to see his nephew returned, digging his claws into the stone floor of the cave. He excuses Columbo so that he can have a word with his nephew, but Columbo insists he stays because Simba helped him solve the case. He knows who killed Mufasa. More gasps ring out, and Scar is looking awfully antsy. He tells Columbo that this is no time for such talk, but Columbo doesn't stop. He goes on to say that Simba told him what happened at the gorge that day and who was there. Simba knows who was behind the stampede. Columbo then steps aside to let Simba reveal who did it. The lion cub hesitates and looks around at his mother, his uncle, and even Columbo. And then he raises his paw and points it at the hyenas, specifically Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed. All eyes fall on the trio, who were completely caught off guard. Columbo thanks Simba and explains that Mufasa saved Simba from the stampede, but fell while trying to climb out of the gorge. When the stampede ended and Simba went to check on Mufasa, the hyenas ambushed him and tried to kill him. The same hyenas that attacked him and Nala at the elephant graveyard. Simba panicked and ran for his life. He barely escaped by slipping through the bramble patch and ran away into the desert, where he was saved by Timon and Pumbaa. Columbo figures the only way those hyenas could have known to look for him down there is if they started the stampede in the first place. Every lioness growls and bares their teeth at the trio, who are fumbling over their words trying to come up with an explanation. Well, Shenzi and Banzai are. Ed just stares blankly ahead. With a mighty roar, Scar silences the trio and demands they be taken away until further notice. He assures the crowd that he will personally punish the culprits for their treasonous acts, and then, begrudgingly, commends Columbo for his work. He even offers Columbo a generous cut from the latest hunt, but Columbo turns him down. He's just happy that Simba is safe and that the real culprits have been caught. It's a good thing, too, because for a while, Columbo was almost certain that Scar was behind all this. The sun dips below the horizon, and the silence that falls upon Pride Rock is deafening. Columbo laughs it off and explains how, for a while, Scar seemed like the top suspect. After all, he didn't seem to be on good terms with Mufasa in the first place, and had the most to gain from his demise. If he could take out Simba too, he would be next in line for the throne. Columbo figures all Scar had to do was trick Simba into going somewhere sketchy, like the elephant graveyard, and let the hyenas do all the dirty work. After all, he was already on good terms with them and could promise them all the food they could want. That is, if they could get the job done. But they didn't. Scar didn't account on Zazu getting Mufasa to come and save the day. By this point, a lot of lionesses are intrigued by this, and even Nala is concerned. Scar clears his throat and tries to shut up Columbo, but the Lion Guard captain continues, telling everyone about his theory that the stampede was Scar's backup plan. If he lured Simba into the gorge, his hyenas could scare the wildebeest herd into stampeding, while he warns Mufasa and lets him risk his life to save his son. How else would he know that Simba was in trouble? What are the odds that Scar just happened to be passing by and see his nephew in peril? He also would have learned his lesson and gotten rid of Zazu this time. Not kill him, though. Otherwise, that would just raise suspicion. Scar could have watched the whole thing play out, and if Mufasa somehow climbed out, he could have thrown him back down. His brother wouldn't have seen it coming until it was too late. The only loose end would have been Simba. But again, all Scar would have to do was send his hyenas to finish him off. It would have looked suspicious if there were claw marks on Simba. Then he could cry some crocodile tears and take his position as the new king. At least, that's what Columbo thought for a while. But then he assures everyone that when he talked with Simba, the young cub told him that it was just those 3 hyenas who were behind all this. No one else. Columbo was so relieved when he heard that, because it would have been real awkward to accuse Scar of murdering his own brother. Columbo lets out a wry laugh, while everyone stands there astounded by what they just heard. Zazu and some of the lionesses give Scar dirty looks, while Simba seems baffled by all of this. Shenzi and Banzai raise their voice and try to shout out that it was Scar's idea, but they get escorted away from the group. Columbo says it's a good thing that they were able to clear that up, but Scar isn't having any of this. He's scowling harder than anyone's seen him scowl before. And that's saying something. Scar would say that he's quite right. And while they're clearing things up, Scar wants to make something else clear. Now that the threat has been dealt with, there's no more need for the Lion Guard or Columbo. He decrees that the Lion Guard is to be disbanded, and that Columbo is to be exiled immediately. This creates quite an uproar with the lionesses, but Scar is quick to silence them and remind them that he is their king, and his authority shall not be questioned. Columbo isn't fazed by any of this, and is willing to leave without a fight. He knows better than to defy the king. He says his goodbyes and is about to take his leave. But then Simba, of all creatures, speaks up and asks Scar a question. "Why did you want me to go to the gorge?" All eyes fall back on Scar as Columbo stops to listen to this. Once again, Simba asks why Scar told him to go to the gorge. He said that Scar had a surprise for him right before the stampede. Scar's mouth hangs open as he tries to find his voice. Columbo finds this interesting and asks if Scar was the one who told Simba about the elephant graveyard. Scar takes offense to this and directs all of his anger at Columbo. This investigation is over, and that this was all the work of those awful hyenas. Columbo clarifies that he's talking about the hyenas he was friends with. Scar refutes this and claims that those hyenas mean nothing to him. The hyenas are the real enemy. It was their fault. Their idea! Is that right? Columbo asks. As Scar continues to huff and puff, a new sound permeates the air and fills Scar with dread. The snarling of every single hyena. It's only then that he realizes that every creature there, Sarabi, Nala, Shenzi, Banzai, Ed, Zazu, Timon, Pumbaa, and Simba, they're all glaring at him. Columbo clears his throat yet again and says that he should take his leave now and wishes the king good luck, especially since he has no one to defend him from his enemies anymore. It's a shame, too, that Scar wasn't the culprit. If he was, Scar would have simply been exiled. Columbo hopes everyone has a nice evening and starts to leave. But then, Scar calls out for him to stop. Columbo looks back and sees the defeated look on the king's face as he mutters the words, "Damn you." And thus, we come to the end of our investigation, and the truth comes out. Scar confessed to the murder of Mufasa, and, just as Columbo promised, Scar was exiled from the Pride Lands, never to return. Shortly after, the hyenas also vacated Pride Rock and took their leave as well. Incidentally, they were last seen traveling in the same direction as Scar. Wonder if they'll bump into each other. As for Simba, he's been reunited with his mother and continues to be prepped to take the throne once he comes of age. Sarabi and Zazu intend to watch over the Pride Lands until then, which should give him plenty of time to reconnect with his pal Nala. The lionesses were given strict orders to not hunt the warthog and meerkat that saved Simba, and that the two would be free to visit Simba whenever they wanted. As for Columbo, he was reinstated back into the Lion Guard the moment Scar was out of sight, and continues to serve the royal family. However, there was something that's been puzzling Simba for a while. Why did Columbo tell him to lie about what happened at the gorge? See, when Columbo initially found Simba at the oasis, he grilled the cub on what happened at the gorge. It took a while to earn his trust, but once Columbo got it, he learned that Scar was the one who brought Simba out there, and after Mufasa died, Scar blamed Simba and told him to never come back. From there, Columbo was able to piece together what really happened and figured out that Scar was the killer. But he needed a way to expose him. If Columbo just accused Scar outright, the king would have denied it and thrust blame onto Simba. And when Columbo suggested that Scar was the one that killed Mufasa, Simba refused to believe it or testify against his uncle. So Columbo hatched a plan to hoist the king with his own petard and get Simba to believe him. Columbo told Simba to accuse the hyenas closest to Scar so that when Columbo casually dropped his theory about Scar's scheme, everyone would be suspicious of him and the tyrant would shift the blame onto the hyenas in an act of desperation, leaving Scar with no allies to protect him and no choice but to come clean so that he could flee with his skin intact. For now, at least. And with that, all is well that ends well. Sure, Simba is going to need some time to process his father's demise and the fact that his uncle tried to kill him twice, but at least he still has his mom and his best friend, as well as 2 adoptive dads. He's back home surrounded by people who love him, Scar got his comeuppance, and Columbo has cracked the case. Thanks for tuning in to the premiere episode of this experimental little podcast I came up with. Let me know what you thought of this scenario. Did I miss any important details? Do you think it would have played out differently? Let me know so that I can take that into account and fine-tune this crazy project of mine as I move forward. The music you're listening to is called Phoenix Noir by Stephen F. Allen, aka Audiomirage. He composed this and most of the transitional music, Sonepalaj. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. SergeQuadrado composed the piano piece, Mercy Piano, and the climactic music titled The Battle of Scorpio and Orion was done by Matrix XX_. The sound effects were done by nomiqbomi. All of these artists can be found on freesound.org, and links to their profile can be found in the description below. I hope you had fun, and that you'll tune in next time for Columbo's next case, the murder of Norman Osborn from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man.